Does calorie restriction actually work or not? Let's get into it. So, folks, it's important. Sorry, I'm learning to take my time in the beginning because some of these, I'm streaming on multiple platforms and some of them don't start right away. So I'm just going to give it a little pause for a second, and I'm just going to ramble for a little half a second before I get going. So, what I want to say, folks, is that it's important to ask the right questions, right? So if we're saying, does calorie restriction work, right? This is the idea promoted by many health influencers that all you have to do is count calories and make sure that you spend more calories than you burn. That is wrong on so many levels. I didn't even want to get into it. It's just such an idiotic statement. But let's just focus on one piece of that statement, which is when you reduce calories, does it quote unquote work? Now, in order to understand that, the first thing you have to ask is, does it work for what? Does it work for who? Does it work to do what? What is your goal, right? And the answer will usually come back, well, I want to lose weight. Now, again, when you say you want to lose weight, what exactly do you want to lose? Like, you could chop off a finger and you'd lose a bit of weight. That's not what anyone wants, right? We have to be really specific. You want to lose fat, most likely. Most likely, you want to lose visceral fat, which is the fat around your waist. Maybe some people want to lose fat, especially women want to lose fat around their legs and bum and so on, that area too. But it's basically fat mass that you want to lose, right? So if you ask the question, okay, let's rephrase the question. Does caloric restriction specifically lead to losses in fat mass? The answer is yes, sort of. It leads to weight loss overall, and some of that will undoubtedly be fat. Some of that will be other lean tissue, right? No question about it. But so that's yes, it works, right? But is it healthy? Is it the right thing to do? And there, the answer will be it'll vary by person to person, but we almost never recommend it. Why? Well, in order to understand why we almost never recommend caloric restriction, you have to understand why it might work for fat mass loss in the first place, right? Why might it work for fat mass loss? Well, there's a blog I've written that goes into this in a lot of detail. But just to go into the punchline, and maybe I'll put a link to that blog in the comments below at some point. But just to sort of cut to the punchline, what happens is if your insulin levels go down, if your insulin is under control, if your insulin levels come down, then you lose weight, right? And that's extremely dramatic in the case of type 1 diabetics who don't produce any insulin. And if you don't treat it, if you don't inject them with insulin, they're going to lose a lot of weight. They're going to lose weight to the point that they're going to die, basically. But in general, if your fasting insulin goes from like 10 to like 5, you're going to lose a lot of weight, right? And one of the ways in which you can reduce fasting insulin is through caloric restriction. You can just reduce the amount of food you're eating. You'll reduce the insulin response. You'll reduce the amount of insulin in your blood. Insulin is the fat storage hormone. That's one way to think about it. When your insulin levels are high, this is an analogy that I think Jason Fung uses. Imagine that you have an overpacked subway car, like a Japanese subway car full of people, and you have people pushing it in. Obviously, those people can't really get out when they're being pushed in by the subway car operators. Another way to think about it is an overstuffed suitcase. Insulin is the thing just stuffing more stuff in the suitcase or making sure that stuff that's in the suitcase can't come out, right? Okay, so that's insulin in a nutshell. When our insulin levels come down, it means there's fewer of those guards, there's fewer of those people stuffing stuff into the suitcase, and we lose weight basically. We can actually spend the fat, we can actually expend the fat as part of a process to convert adenosine diphosphate ADP into adenosine triphosphate ATP, and that will result in losing the fat mass and a few other things, right? Fine, good, understood. The problem is when you do that through caloric restriction, you're going to have other things that come up, right? The most serious thing that I've talked about in that same blog and in other places is that your basal metabolic rate is going to go down, right? Basal metabolic rate means, this is the other side of the equation. When you think about calories in, calories out, when you think about the calories out, all people really talk about is exercise. But exercise is a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of what's actually going on in terms of the potential energy that you're expending, in terms of what you need to get all these chemical reactions in your body in order to most of the time you're not exercising, right? And even if you're exercising hard, it's not what's going on most of the time. What matters most of the time is the amount of quote unquote energy, not exactly the right term, but the amount of chemical processes that are needed to keep your heart pumping, that are needed to keep your brain active, that are needed to keep you just functional and moving and doing everyday things, right? That is called your BMR, basal metabolic rate. Now, when you restrict calories, your basal metabolic rate is known to go down, right? This is very well documented in study after study after study. If you do caloric restriction, it results in a lower BMR, meaning that the more you diet, the more you do these caloric restrictions, the harder it's going to be for you to lose weight, even when you're not dieting. You're going to have to eat less, even when the diet is over, when you're no longer caloric restricting. You're going to have to eat less than you were eating before the diet because your overall expenditure has gone down. Why does it do that? Because the body basically thinks you're an idiot. The body thinks this person doesn't know how to hunt, doesn't know how to find food. And so we have to put a pause on things. And in some cases, and I've seen this happen again and again, you can have people on a low calorie vegan diet, that sort of thing. And women who are in their 20s, they lose their period, right? Even men get kind of sluggish and they lose their libido. It gets a little weird, right? Because you can imagine if you're living in a time of famine, that is not the time to be making babies, right? So it makes sense that nature would provide ways to tank our testosterone. Nature would provide ways to destroy our ability to have a child if we were a woman, right? So this all, when you think about it from the standpoint of first principles, it all makes perfect sense, right? So caloric restriction works for certain objectives at certain times, but we never, ever, ever recommend it, right? What do we recommend in its place? Well, again, go back to that first principle. So if we say that high insulin was the issue, well, then there are many other ways to reduce high insulin. Most notably, insulin responds a hell of a lot to carbohydrate. Just stop eating the damn carbohydrate and you're going to do much better, right? It's not rocket science here, right? Just reduce the amount of carbohydrates in the diet dramatically, whatever that is. And the starting point, if you're having, I don't know, some people are having 400 and 500 grams of carbohydrate a day. You don't need to measure these things, but if you look at your plate, for example, I used to spend a lot of time in Asia. I used to spend a lot of time in a place called Bangladesh. The standard meal in my office when I was working for a company that had offices all over the world, including in Bangladesh, when you went to the cafeteria and got a plate of food, before you put anything on it, you would have the option, you want to put some vegetables, you want to put some meat, you want to put whatever you want. Before you do that, the plate comes as full of rice. You pick up the thing, it's full of rice. It's a big bed of rice. And then you're putting any meat and veg and so on top of that. Now, if that's your plate, like just half the amount of rice on there. And by default, you will increase the amount of meat and the amount of veggies and so on. Then later on, after a couple of weeks, half the amount of rice again, right? So, and if you think you won't lose weight that way, you lose weight very, very quickly that way. And it is much more sustainable because you see, you're still listening to your body's signals. There's been this whole movement around intuitive eating and so on, and I'm not a big fan of that term, and I'm not a big fan of doing that because my intuition could be telling me to eat 20 Twix bars, and I could justify it that way. And I think if you're using it that way, then it's not a good idea. But when you're using it together with some discipline and together with some common sense, say, no, we're going to get the sugar out of the diet, number one. Number two, we're going to have the amount of carbs on the plate. And then take it from there. Then have it again after a couple of weeks, right? So what's going to happen when you do that? You're automatically going to eat more of the fish, the meat, the eggs, the dairy, right? The other things that are going to fill you up, basically. And you'll see that the weight will come off. And in addition, your heart risk rate will go down. Your risk of dementia goes down. Like your risk of all these chronic diseases goes down when you reduce the amount of carbohydrates on the plate, okay? So that's a very simple solution, in my opinion, to a fairly simple problem. I used to think back in my vegan and vegetarian days, I used to wonder, like, why can't I lose any weight no matter how disciplined I am, no matter what I do? Why can't I do any of this stuff? Why? And my doctors were also, it wasn't just the weight, it was also my cholesterol profile and my knees aching and my eyesight was going away. Like it was many different things. But once I figured out that it's really all about the sugar consumption and the carbohydrate consumption, carbohydrates, of course, are just polysaccharides, many sugars together, right? And once I understood that that's really the root of all my issues, and I just need to get rid of those, suddenly everything started. And by the way, I didn't go full carnivore. This is before I was on a sort of zero carb kick. This was when I was just trying to be a little bit disciplined, reduce the carbohydrates. And by default, you end up eating more of the other macronutrients, more protein, more fat. And you eat to satiety all the time. And the weight just melts off as a byproduct of getting more healthy, of getting more fit. Okay? So some food for thought. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next one.